In 1921, Tulsa's Greenwood District, widely known as Black Wall Street, stood as a powerful symbol of economic independence, ambition, and hope in an America shaped by segregation and inequality. At a time when opportunities for black citizens were systematically limited, Greenwood rose against the odds. Its streets were lined with thriving businesses, professional offices, activisms as theaters, newspapers, churches, and homes owned by black families who believed deeply in self-reliance and collective progress. This was not just a neighborhood. It was proof that success was possible, even when the system was designed to deny it. But history has a way of hiding its most uncomfortable truths. For decades, the story of Black Wall Street was barely mentioned, quietly removed from textbooks, conversations, and public memory. How could a community so vibrant, so full of promise, simply disappear from the national narrative? What forces were powerful enough to erase not only buildings and livelihoods, but also voices, names, and dreams? This story is not only about the past. It is about power, fear, and the consequences of refusing to confront injustice. It is about how economic success can challenge deeply rooted social structures and what can happen when that challenge is met with silence instead of accountability. Greenwood's rise and fall reveal a hidden chapter of American history that still echoes today in discussions about inequality, justice, and remembrance. In this video, we will uncover the untold truth behind the Tulsa race riot of 1921, why it happened, how it was hidden for so long, and why it still matters now. We will journey back to a time of ambition and resilience, and explore lessons that continue to shape our world. If stories like this matter to youstries that history tried to forget, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others. Your support helps bring hidden truths into the light. As Greenwood continued to flourish, its success did not exist in isolation. Beyond the borders of Black Wall Street, Tulsa was a city struggling to redefine itself after World War I. Jobs were scarce, wages were unstable, and many white residents who had expected prosperity after the war instead found themselves facing uncertainty and frustration. In this tense atmosphere, Greenwood's visible growth stood in sharp contrast to the hardships surrounding it, and that contrast quietly transformed admiration into suspicion, then resentment. For many white Tulsans, Greenwood challenged an unspoken social order they had long taken for granted. The idea that a black community could not only survive but thrive building wealth, owning property, and supporting its own institutions felt unsettling to those who believed economic power should remain firmly divided along racial lines. Greenwood's success was not hidden. It was proudly displayed in brick buildings, busy streets, and businesses that circulated money within the community rather than sending it outward. Each sign of progress became, to some observers, a reminder of their own declining fortunes. This resentment did not form overnight. It grew slowly, fed by rumors, stereotypes, and a climate of fear that painted black economic independence as a threat rather than an achievement. Newspapers of the era often framed black success through a distorted lens, subtly reinforcing the idea that Greenwood's prosperity was unnatural or undeserved. At the same time, organizations that promoted racial hierarchy found fertile ground in Tulsa, offering simple explanations for complex economic problems. Instead of addressing the structural causes of post-war hardship, they redirected frustration toward Greenwood, turning neighbors into perceived rivals. The presence and influence of white supremacist groups further deepened these divisions. Their messages were carefully crafted to appeal to anxiety, suggesting that Greenwood's rise signaled a loss of control and status for white citizens. Through rallies, social pressure, and quiet intimidation, these groups normalized hostility and reframed envy as self-defense. In doing so, they transformed economic jealousy into moral justification, making discrimination feel acceptable, even necessary. So, to those who embraced their ideology. Yet what made the situation especially volatile was how close these two worlds existed to one another. Greenwood was not a distant or abstract success story. It was visible every day, just across town. White residents could see black professionals walking confidently into offices, families attending cultural events, and businesses operating without reliance on white-owned institutions. This proximity intensified emotions because Greenwood's achievements were impossible to ignore. Prosperity, when seen up close, can inspire hope or provoke fear, depending on the lens through which it is viewed. Rather than recognizing Greenwood as evidence of resilience and determination, many chose to see it as a challenge to social dominance. Economic hardship made this perception sharper, not softer. In difficult times, people often search for someone to blame, and Greenwood became an easy target. Its success was reinterpreted as provocation, its independence mistaken for defiance. What should have been a shared moment of civic pride instead became a source of division. This growing tension settled over Tulsa like an unspoken storm. Conversations changed, attitudes hardened, and trust eroded, while Greenwood residents continued building their community with optimism and discipline. Few could foresee how deeply resentment had taken root beyond their streets. The city appeared calm on the surface, but underneath, fear and anger were quietly aligning, waiting for a moment that would bring everything into the open. In this way, Greenwood's rise did more than showcase economic strength. It exposed the fragile foundations of a society struggling to reconcile progress with prejudice. The conflict that followed was not simply about one community's success, but about how a nation responds when long-standing assumptions are challenged by undeniable evidence of possibility. Against this backdrop of tension and unspoken hostility, the spark that ignited the tragedy came not from a calculated plan, but from a brief, ambiguous moment that should never have carried such weight. On May 30th, 1921, Dick Rowland, a young black shoeshiner, entered an elevator in a downtown Tulsa building. Inside was Sarah Page, a white elevator operator. What happened during those few seconds was never clearly established, and no evidence ever proved malicious intent. Yet in a city already charged with fear and resentment, uncertainty was enough to become dangerous. In an era defined by rigid racial hierarchies, even the most ordinary interactions between black men and white women were viewed through a lens of suspicion. Social norms were enforced not only by law, but by rumor and assumption, and those assumptions often carried more power than facts. When word spread that something had happened in that elevator, speculation filled the gaps where truth should have been. Whispers traveled faster than reason, shaped by long-standing prejudices rather than verified accounts. Local media played a critical role in transforming ambiguity into outrage. Headlines and commentary amplified fear instead of seeking clarity, framing the incident in ways that reinforced existing stereotypes. The careful language of investigation was replaced by emotionally charged narratives that appealed to anger and anxiety. In a city already uneasy about Greenwood's success, this coverage did not simply report events. It influenced how they were understood. The story became less about what actually occurred and more about what people were conditioned to believe. As rumors spread, they gained momentum with each retelling. Details shifted, accusations hardened, county classes is no man, and the truth became increasingly irrelevant. What mattered was how the incident fit into a broader story. Many were already prepared to accept that Greenwood represented a challenge to the established order, and that any perceived transgression could be used to justify retaliation. Systemic racism ensured that Dick Rowland was presumed guilty long before any facts were examined, while restraint and due process were treated as optional. Within Greenwood, the mood shifted from concern to alarm. Residents understood the danger of silence as well as the danger of confrontation. They had seen how quickly rumors could turn into violence, and many feared that this incident would be used as an excuse to act on long-held resentment. The community's efforts to protect itself were rooted not in aggression, but in survival, shaped by years of navigating a society that rarely offered protection in return. Meanwhile, outside Greenwood, fear fed on itself. Groups gathered, conversations grew more heated, and the line between rumor and certainty disappeared entirely. The incident involving Rowland and Page was no longer viewed as an isolated moment. It had been transformed into a symbol, distorted to fit the narrative of those who felt threatened by Greenwood's existence. This transformation was not accidental. It was the product of a system that rewarded outrage, excused prejudice, and treated black lives as expendable. What makes this moment so significant is not just how quickly events escalated, but how predictably they did so. The conditions had been in place for years: economic envy, racial division, and institutions that failed to value truth equally for all. The elevator incident did not create these forces. It merely activated them. It provided a pretext, a thin veil of justification for actions that many were already prepared to take. In the hours that followed, Tulsa crossed a point of no return. Decisions were made in haste, fueled by fear rather than facts, and supported by a system that allowed bias to masquerade as justice. The violence that emerged was not the result of a single encounter between two individuals, but the culmination of long-suppressed tensions finally unleashed. This moment stands as a powerful reminder of how fragile peace can be when truth is overshadowed by rumor and inequality. It reveals how quickly a society can abandon reason when prejudice is allowed to shape the narrative, and how devastating the consequences can be when systemic injustice turns uncertainty into catastrophe. As night fell and tension reached its breaking point, the fragile balance holding Tulsa together finally collapsed. What had begun as rumor and fear now turned into open destruction, sweeping through Greenwood with devastating speed. Groups of white residents gathered in growing numbers, emboldened not only by anger, but by the belief that their actions would go unchallenged. In the chaos that followed, lines between civilians and authority blurred, and the systems meant to protect order instead allowed violence to spread unchecked. Greenwood awoke to terror. Streets that had once echoed with conversation and commerce were suddenly filled with confusion and panic. Fires broke out one after another, consuming homes, businesses, and places of worship that had taken years to build. Brick walls cracked under the heat, wooden structures collapsed into embers, and entire blocks vanished beneath smoke and ash. Families fled with whatever they could carry, while others were forced to abandon everything they owned in moments that felt unreal and irreversible. Eyewitnesses later recalled scenes that defied belief. Aircraft were seen circling overhead, dropping incendiaries that ignited rooftops and accelerated the destruction below. While official records would later downplay or deny these accounts, the consistency of survivor testimonies painted a far more disturbing picture. Greenwood was not simply attacked from the ground. It was overwhelmed from all sides, leaving residents with no safe direction to turn. The role of local authorities deepened the tragedy. Instead of acting as neutral protectors, many officers stood aside or actively assisted those carrying out the destruction. Weapons were distributed, arrests were selectively enforced, and Greenwood's residents were treated not as victims, but as suspects. This imbalance of power sent a clear message. The community could not rely on the institutions meant to ensure safety and justice. In those critical hours, the absence of protection became a form of permission. As the violence intensified, entire families were forced into detention under armed guard. Thousands of black residents were rounded up and taken to makeshift holding areas, separated from their homes, while fires continued to burn behind them. From a distance, they watched the physical evidence of their lives disappear: businesses reduced to rubble, personal belongings turned to ash, and dreams erased in a single night. Survival came at the cost of everything familiar. By the time calm was restored, Greenwood was unrecognizable. More than 35 city blocks lay in ruins. Over 1,200 homes had been destroyed, and an estimated 300 people had lost their lives. The true number would never be fully known, as many deaths went unrecorded, and some victims were buried without names. Thousands were left homeless, wandering through the aftermath with no clear path forward, struggling to understand how such devastation could happen so quickly and so completely. What followed was almost as painful as the destruction itself. No meaningful effort was made to provide immediate relief or long-term support. Insurance claims were denied, responsibility was deflected, and the narrative was reshaped to portray Greenwood as the cause of its own ruin. The loss was not acknowledged in proportion to its scale, and accountability was quietly avoided. In the silence that followed, the physical devastation hardened into something deeper and more enduring. Yet even in ruin, Greenwood's story did not end. Amid the ashes, survivors clung to one another, drawing strength from shared memory and determination. Their resilience stood in contrast to the forces that sought to erase them, proving that while buildings could be destroyed, Identity and resolve could not be so easily extinguished. The destruction of Greenwood was not just an act of violence against a community, but an attempt to erase an idea that progress could exist without permission. This chapter of the story reveals how quickly fear, when reinforced by power, can unravel everything in its path. It shows how institutions can fail when prejudice is allowed to guide action, and how devastating the consequences can be when protection is denied to those who need it most. Greenwood's destruction was not accidental, nor inevitable, but the result of choices made in moments when justice mattered most and was absent. When the smoke finally lifted and the fires burned themselves out, the suffering did not end with the destruction of Greenwood. For the survivors, the aftermath marked the beginning of a quieter but equally devastating chapter, one defined by confinement, silence, and abandonment. Those who had escaped the chaos were not welcomed back into their neighborhoods to rebuild or recover. Instead, many were detained under armed supervision, herded into temporary holding areas and camps, separated from what little remained of their lives. Freedom, in the moment they needed it most, was replaced by control and suspicion. From behind fences and guarded perimeters, survivors watched the ruins of Greenwood cool into ash. Homes that had represented stability and pride were reduced to empty foundations. Businesses that once sustained families and circulated wealth within the community no longer existed. Yet even as the scale of loss became undeniable, the response from institutions that should have offered relief was marked by indifference and deflection. Assistance was slow, limited, or absent altogether, leaving thousands to navigate loss without meaningful support. One of the most painful blows came when survivors attempted to reclaim a sense of normalcy through insurance claims. Many had believed that policies would provide a path toward rebuilding, a small measure of security in the face of devastation. Instead, claims were overwhelmingly denied, dismissed under technicalities that labeled the destruction as unrest rather than catastrophe. In a single decision, financial recovery was made nearly impossible, ensuring that loss would extend far beyond the immediate aftermath and into future generations. As survivors struggled to find shelter, employment, and stability, the narrative surrounding the events began to shift in troubling ways. Responsibility for the destruction was subtly redirected, framing Greenwood not as a victim of injustice, but as a source of disorder. This reframing allowed those in power to distance themselves from accountability while reinforcing harmful assumptions. The truth of what had happened became increasingly obscured, not through open denial alone, but through omission and distortion. In the months and years that followed, silence settled over Tulsa. Public discussion of Greenwood faded, not because the pain had healed, but because acknowledgement became inconvenient. Official records were altered or removed, reports minimized, cases minimized, and the story gradually disappeared from classrooms, libraries, and public memory. Children grew up unaware that a thriving community had once stood where empty spaces now remained. Greenwood was erased not only from the landscape, but from the shared understanding of history. For survivors, this silence was deeply isolating. Their memories lived on in fragmentaries passed quietly within families, moments recalled with caution and grief. Speaking openly risked disbelief or dismissal, and so many chose to endure quietly, carrying the weight of injustice without recognition. The absence of justice was not just legal, it was emotional and cultural, reinforcing the message that their suffering did not matter enough to be remembered. Decades passed before cracks began to form in this carefully maintained silence. As new generations questioned what had been omitted from the historical record, survivors and their descendants found the courage to speak more openly. Their testimonies challenged the official narrative, revealing gaps that could no longer be ignored. Slowly, Greenwood's story resurfaced, not as rumor or exaggeration, but as a documented truth supported by lived experience. Yet even as awareness grew, the lack of accountability remained a painful reality. No meaningful consequences had followed the devastation, no full restitution offered, and no comprehensive effort made to restore what had been taken. The impact of that failure lingered in the form of lost wealth, interrupted futures, committed cases, and a deep mistrust of systems meant to protect citizens equally. This period of erasure reveals that injustice does not end when violence stops. It continues through neglect, denial, and the refusal to confront uncomfortable truths. Greenwood's destruction was followed by an equally damaging attempt to forget it, demonstrating how power can shape memory as effectively as it shapes events. And still, despite decades of silence, the story endured, waiting for a moment when it could finally be told, acknowledged, and understood as part of a larger struggle for truth and dignity. In recent decades, the silence surrounding Greenwood has finally begun to break. What was once buried under denial and omission has resurfaced through the determination of survivors, descendants, historians, and researchers who refused to let the truth remain hidden. Official investigations launched years after the massacre confirmed what the Black community had always known, that the scale of destruction had been severely understated, the loss of life minimized, and responsibility carefully avoided. These findings did more than correct the historical record. They challenged a long-standing narrative that had allowed injustice to fade into obscurity. Perhaps the most powerful confirmation came with the discovery of mass graves. Using modern forensic science and ground-penetrating technology, investigators uncovered physical evidence that supported decades of survivor testimony. These discoveries transformed memory into undeniable fact. They served as a solemn reminder that history leaves traces, even when institutions attempt to erase them. Each finding reinforced the reality that the Tulsa race massacre was not an isolated incident, but a deliberate act rooted in systemic inequality and sustained by silence. Yet the story of Greenwood is not defined solely by loss. It is also a story of resilience. Despite unimaginable devastation, survivors rebuilt what they could, passing down memories, values, and determination to future generations. Their perseverance ensured that Greenwood's legacy endured, not just as a tragedy, but as a testament to strength in the face of overwhelming injustice. The community's spirit survived, even when its buildings did not, reminding us that progress cannot be fully destroyed when people refuse to forget who they are. Today, the Tulsa Race Massacre stands as a powerful symbol in national conversations about justice and accountability. It forces a reckoning with how systemic racism operates not only through acts of violence, but through policies, silence, and the denial of repair. Calls for reparations are not simply about the past. They are about addressing generational harm that continues to shape opportunity, wealth, and trust. Greenwood's story makes clear that healing requires more than acknowledgement. It requires action, honesty, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Remembering Greenwood matters because history shapes the present. When stories like this are ignored, the patterns that created them are allowed to continue. When they are told fully and truthfully, they become tools for understanding and change. The Tulsa Race Massacre reminds us that justice delayed is not justice denied, it is justice unfinished. And unfinished justice continues to echo across generations. As we reflect on this history, we honor those whose lives were disrupted, erased, or forever changed, and we recognize the responsibility that comes with knowing the truth. Memory is not passive. It is an active choice to see clearly, to listen carefully, and to carry lessons forward. Thank you for taking the time to watch and engage with this story. If this video helped deepen your understanding or encouraged you to reflect on history in a new way, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps ensure that stories once hidden are never forgotten again, and that the lessons of the past continue to reach those willing to listen. Continue to reach those willing to listen.